The cameras were rolling. The lights were blinding. And the air in the studio? It was heavy, like something unspoken had already entered the room. It was supposed to be just another political panel. The kind cable news airs every night. Talking heads, safe soundbites, some fireworks for ratings. But tonight wasn't like the others. On one side of the glass table sat Karoline Leavitt, former Trump spokesperson, sharp suit, sharper tongue. On the other side, Captain Ibrahim Traore, a quiet, composed man from Burkina Faso. A soldier. A leader. Invited to talk about African sovereignty and America's role abroad. The producers expected polite disagreement. What they got was history. It started when Captain Traoré questioned U.S. involvement in West Africa. Not angrily. Not with blame. Just facts. Calm, clear. That's when Karoline leaned in, her voice cold, her finger raised. "Sit down, boy." The studio froze. Even the host looked stunned. Silence fell like a curtain. Viewers across the country stopped mid-bite, mid-scroll. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't storm off. He stood. Slowly. Silently. Not like a man rising to argue, but like someone carrying generations on his shoulders. He walked to the edge of the stage, turned to the crowd, and began to speak, not with fire, but with something far deeper. "I come from a place," he said quietly, "where boys become men before they're old enough to dream." You could hear a pin drop. "You can call me boy here," he said, turning toward Karoline, "but where I come from, boys carry nations. They lead because no one else will." A murmur rippled through the room. A tear welled up in the eyes of an older black woman in the front row. This wasn't politics anymore. This was something sacred. "I buried my father beneath the sky," Traoré continued. "No cameras. No speeches. Just dirt and my mother's grief." The audience sat still, locked in place. Some forgot to breathe. "He died in a coup funded by people who said they were helping us." His eyes flicked, briefly, toward Karoline. She didn't meet his gaze. "So when you say, 'Sit down, boy,' do you mean the boy who watched his village burn? The boy who studied by candlelight because the power never came back on after the colonizers left?" One of the panelists, a retired U.S. Army veteran, slowly placed a hand over his heart. "You don't have to like me," Traoré said, "but you will not erase me." A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then the entire room stood. Not in pity, but in reverence. Karoline, who had once filled the room with presence, now seemed smaller, quieter. Traoré looked down for a moment, not in shame, but as if searching for the right words. And then he lifted his eyes again. "You see a soldier," he said, "but I was raised by a woman with nothing but her bare hands." He paused. "Let the weight of that truth settle. My mother sold firewood to send me to school. Walked miles in broken sandals. Skipped meals so I wouldn't go hungry." The camera cut to Karoline. Her smirk gone. Whatever she meant to say, she didn't say it. And she didn't need to. Because somehow, in all his pain, Traoré had transformed her insult into something holy. "When someone like you calls me boy," he said gently, "you're not insulting me. You're insulting every mother who ever carried a country on her back." This time, the silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even the host had tears in his eyes. Then a voice rang out, unexpected, strong. "He's right." Everyone turned. It was the veteran. "He's more of a man than most of us in this room." No one argued. No one could. And somewhere in the front row, a little girl whispered to her father, "He sounds like you." He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. But when Colonel Jacob Whitmore stood, the silence was instant. White-haired, decorated, a veteran whose presence demanded attention, even without speaking. But now, his voice was trembling. "I served in Liberia," he said, eyes locked on Traoré. "I've seen what boys like him face. What he survived. That's not a debate point. That's a war medal." The camera zoomed in. His hand was shaking. Not from weakness, but from remembering. "Calling him boy doesn't just insult him," the colonel said. It insults every brave man and woman I served with in Africa." Karoline Leavitt shifted uncomfortably. She looked smaller than before. Not just in stature, but in presence, like someone shrinking under the weight of their own words. Captain Traoré turned to the colonel. Not a grand gesture, just a quiet nod. A soldier's respect. And then, something powerful happened. The colonel walked over, extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, voice now steady. "Not just for defending your country, but for reminding us what honor actually looks like." They shook hands. The applause that followed wasn't loud at first. It was deep, tearful, earned. Even those who didn't know where Burkina Faso was. Now they felt connected to it. To him. Karoline, who had started the night with a room in her grip, now sat in the shadows of her own silence. She didn't expect this. She thought calling him boy would be clever. Maybe even get a few claps. Instead, it boomeranged. "Oh, come on," she snapped suddenly, her voice cutting through the room like glass. "Are we seriously pretending he's some kind of saint now?" The audience flinched. Gasps. Glances. Eyes narrowing, not in confusion, but disappointment. Traoré didn't rise this time. He just looked at her. "This isn't about sainthood," he said. "It's about basic human dignity." Karoline looked to the host for help. But he just stared at her. Even he was stunned. "What's next?" she barked, desperate. "We apologize for being American." And then, from the crowd, a voice rose. A young black woman, barely out of college, stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear. "No," she said. "You apologize for being cruel." The words weren't loud, but they hit like thunder. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a wound opening, live, in front of millions. And Karoline knew she had lost this moment. Whatever power she thought she had was gone. Because Traoré hadn't just responded. He revealed. As he sat back down, the camera caught his eyes. Not angry. Not bitter. Calm. The kind of calm that scares people who rely on chaos. A moment passed. The young woman who had stood up slowly sat again. Her eyes never left Karoline. The studio had changed. You could feel it. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was something heavier. Something real. Karoline tried to claw back the spotlight. Forced a smile. Tried to laugh. "Oh, please," she said. "This is America. We're allowed to disagree." But no one laughed with her. The camera panned across the audience. Tears. Tight hands. A woman held her chest. A man in the back wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Traoré leaned forward, voice gentle. "Disagreement is part of freedom," he said. "But disrespect kills the conversation." He looked straight at Karoline. "And if you kill the conversation, you kill understanding." Applause. Soft at first. Then fuller. Like a song rising from pain. And now, it was Karoline who was silent. She had launched the insult. But now it was buried, under something bigger than her. Something sacred. As the room quieted, Traoré reached inside his jacket. What he pulled out was not dramatic, just a folded piece of paper, creased and worn. He held it up. "This," he said softly, "was written by my younger brother, 2 days before he was killed during a protest." No one clapped now. No one dared. He unfolded the paper, slowly. The edges were frayed. The words barely legible under the studio lights. "Big brother," he read, "if I die, promise me they won't forget why." The air changed. Some people gasped. Others wept. You could hear nothing. No cameras clicking, no staff whispering. Just the sound of breathing. "So no," he said, "I won't sit down. Because I carry the memory of those who were forced to kneel." Karoline blinked rapidly. Her hands trembled under the table. For the first time all night, she had no words. Outside the studio, clips were already going viral. One word kept showing up in the captions: "Watch." And inside, as Traoré folded the letter back into his pocket, the room stayed quiet. Not because it had nothing to say, but because for the first time in a long time, People were finally listening. Above the stage, the studio lights flickered softly. Somewhere in the control room, a technician wiped their eyes. No one spoke, until the host, voice low and almost reverent, turned toward the man who now held the room without even trying. "Captain Traoré, is there anything you want to say to the American people watching right now?" Traoré looked directly into the camera. Not as a performer, not as a politician, but as a human being. "Yes," he said simply. "You don't have to know where Burkina Faso is to understand what dignity feels like. You just have to know what it means to be invisible." He leaned in slightly, not to provoke, but to reach. "I've never asked for pity," he said. "Only for eyes that truly see." Karoline's jaw tightened. This was supposed to be her spotlight, her climb, her script. But now she wasn't the center anymore. She was watching the center shift without her, and she could do nothing to stop it. And then something no one expected happened. One of the camera operators, a quiet man in black jeans and headphones, set his rig down, walked onto the stage, and extended his hand to Traoré. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking, "for reminding me what honor looks like." It was raw, unscripted, and it broke something open. From the third row, a middle-aged black woman stood up slowly. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask to speak. "I didn't come here to talk," she said softly. "But I need to." The room turned. Even the cameras hesitated. "My son served in Afghanistan," she continued, her voice catching. "He came home in a box." She wiped her cheek. "They called him boy too, even in uniform." Then she turned to Traoré. "When you spoke, it felt like my son stood up again." Gasps echoed quietly through the studio. The camera found her face, lined with grief, but glowing with something else, validation. Traoré didn't speak. He just nodded. A silent, shared ache. Karoline stirred in her seat, opened her mouth to cut in, but stopped. Even she knew this wasn't her moment anymore. Then the woman said one last thing, and the roof nearly cracked. "America needs men like you," she said. "Not loudmouths who talk over pain." The crowd rose to their feet. Not just clapping, feeling. This wasn't applause. It was a reckoning. Karoline clenched her fists. This was supposed to be her show, her performance, her moment to rise. But she had been eclipsed. "This is a setup," she hissed into her mic. "This isn't journalism, it's emotional theater." The host turned slowly, removing his earpiece. "Karoline," he said calmly, "the cameras are rolling. You created this moment. You just didn't expect it to speak back." She snapped. Her cue cards slammed onto the table. She rose sharply, voice venomous. "I don't need this circus." Her heels clacked hard across the studio floor, each step echoing like a door slamming shut behind her. She didn't look back. The audience didn't boo. They didn't clap. They just watched her go. And as the silence returned, someone in the crowd whispered what millions were thinking: she couldn't handle the truth. The camera slowly panned back to Traoré. Still seated. Still calm. Still unshaken. "I didn't come here to shame her," he said gently. "I came here to speak the truth." The host swallowed hard. His voice barely held together. "Well, the truth is sitting in your seat." The broadcast cut to commercial. But America didn't move. In the control room, producers scrambled. Phones lit up. Emails poured in. And then, a message from the White House press team. Just 3 words. "We saw everything." No one knew exactly what it meant. But everyone felt it mattered. Back on set, as the segment resumed, the host leaned forward again. "Captain Traoré, do you believe America can truly hear someone like you?" Traoré paused, then looked directly into the lens, into every living room, every barbershop, every kitchen in the country. "Yes," he said. "But first, America has to listen when it's uncomfortable." And then, he told a story no one saw coming. "Last year, I visited a children's hospital in Chicago," he said. "A little girl, just 8 years old, had drawn two flags, side by side. One was Burkina Faso. The other was the United States. He paused. She looked up at me and said, "You're both fighting for us." A hush fell over the room. A few tears quietly fell in the crowd. "That child," he said, "understood unity better than most world leaders I've met." And just like that, it was no longer a panel. It was a mirror. By the time the clip hit the internet, it was everywhere. People were pausing dinner. Teachers stopped lessons. Barbers paused mid-fade. The hashtag that once mocked him, #SitDownBoy, flipped. It became a movement. Not in Karoline's name, but in his. Captions flooded social media. "My dad called me crying." This reminded me of 1963. I showed this to my students. And in homes across America, a question lingered: are we finally ready to hear what we never wanted to face? Back in the studio, Captain Traoré sat still, composed, unreadable. He was offered a final chance to respond to Karoline's dramatic exit. He declined. "She's not my enemy," he said. "She's a symptom. The deeper problem is the silence we've all allowed to grow." The audience didn't clap. They listened. Thousands of miles away, in Atlanta, a teenage boy was watching from his bedroom. He picked up his phone. Didn't know who Traoré was an hour ago. Now I want to be like him. What was supposed to be a takedown was turning into a national awakening. The host, visibly shaken, cleared his throat for the final in-studio question. "Captain, what does America need to hear right now?" Before Traoré could answer, an elderly man stood up in the audience. Military uniform. Cane in one hand, chest full of medals. His voice wavered, but his words didn't. "I served in Vietnam," he began. "I lost friends. I came home bitter. And I've watched this country tear itself apart, more than once." He pointed gently toward Traoré. "But never, not in all my years, have I seen a man show such grace after being spit on with disrespect." The camera zoomed in. Tears. Everywhere. "America doesn't just owe this man an apology," the veteran said. "It owes him respect." There was no standing ovation. Only silence. Deep, soul-splitting silence. Captain Traoré stood up slowly, walked over, and shook the old soldier's hand. Two men. Two continents. But one shared truth. That image would go viral within minutes. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolution begins with listening. Just as the broadcast was set to end, the host touched his earpiece. "Captain, we've got a surprise guest on video." The screen behind them came to life. There she was. The little girl from the Chicago hospital. The one who had drawn both flags, Burkina Faso and the U.S., side by side. "Hi, Captain," she beamed, waving her red, white, and green paper flag. "You remembered me." The room melted. "You said I was brave," she smiled. "But tonight, you were the bravest." The audience broke. Not just applause, but sobs. Even the host reached for a tissue and whispered into a hot mic, "My daughter's the same age." Traoré's lips trembled. His hand rose to his heart. "You give me strength," he said. "You're the future I fight for." And then the little girl, with all the clarity of a child who had seen something true, said something no one was prepared for. "Next time someone says, 'Sit down, boy,' I'll tell them, 'Stand up, like Traoré.'" The screen faded to black. And the audience didn't just rise to their feet. They rose to the moment. Because this wasn't television anymore. It was history. Epilogue. That night, back in his Washington hotel room, Traoré sat in quiet reflection. His phone had been buzzing non-stop. World leaders. Celebrities. Veterans. Teachers. Teenagers. But it wasn't the texts that stopped him. It was a letter, slipped quietly under his door. The envelope was hand-addressed. From the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. Inside it read, "Dear Captain Traoré, tonight, you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every soul who was ever told to sit down, boy. We are preparing a permanent exhibit titled, 'Dignity Under Fire.' We would be honored to include your story, your words. and the moment that changed the world. With deepest respect, the board. Traoré folded the letter gently, held it to his chest, and whispered, "Not for me, for all of them." Outside, crowds were beginning to gather. Not in protest, but in gratitude. 1 week later, the studio sat quiet. No lights, no cameras, no live audience. Just Karoline Leavitt. She returned alone. No makeup, no entourage. Just a folded sheet of paper in her hand. She handed it to a producer. "Give this to him," she said. Days later, during a press conference, Traoré read the note aloud. "I said, 'Sit down, boy.' And you stood taller than any man I've ever seen. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope your people, and my daughter, grow up in a world shaped by your strength, not my ignorance." The room went silent again. But not heavy. Hopeful. And Traoré, he looked up from the letter and said, "We don't heal through silence. We heal through courage." And today, she showed some. From that moment on, even his harshest critics stopped using his name casually. They began calling him something else. The man who made America listen. Final scene. The show eventually returned. The world moved on. But one thing in the studio never changed. A single, empty chair. Left untouched. Not in shame, but in memory of the night that changed everything. The cameras were off. The studio was quiet. But something had shifted. Back in his dressing room, Captain Ibrahim Traore sat quietly, barely moving. The live show was over, but its aftershocks were just beginning. In another room, half the studio crew was still wiping away tears. Even the skeptical ones. What they'd witnessed wasn't just a political segment. It was something they'd never forget. He had said nothing cruel. He had raised no voice. He hadn't retaliated when insulted. Instead, when given the chance to respond to the walk-off of a former White House spokesperson, he simply said, "She's not the problem. She's a reflection of something deeper we've been afraid to face." The comment spread like wildfire. A teenage boy in Atlanta posted on X, "Didn't know who Traoré was an hour ago. Now I want to be like him." What was supposed to be a takedown moment had become a turning point. And then, just as the host was preparing to wrap up the show, an elderly white man in full military dress stood up from the crowd. Cane in hand. Medals across his chest. Hands shaking. "Before he answers. That last question," he said, voice trembling, "may I speak?" The camera zoomed in. The studio held its breath. "I fought in Vietnam. I buried friends. I came home broken. And I've watched this country rip itself apart too many times to count. But tonight I saw something I've never seen. A man with every reason to be angry, speak with nothing but grace. That's not weakness. That's strength we don't deserve, but desperately need." He turned toward the host. Then to the lens. America doesn't just owe this man an apology. We owe him respect. No applause. No sound. Just the soft sound of tissues and sniffling. Even the host wiped his eyes. Traoré stood up, crossed the stage, and shook the veteran's hand. 2 soldiers. 2 continents. 1 shared pain. 1 moment of truth. But the night wasn't over yet. A note was handed to the host. He blinked at it. Then announced, "Captain, we have a surprise guest." The screen behind them lit up. A little girl appeared, beaming. It was her. The same child Captain Traoré had mentioned earlier. She was holding a red, white, and green paper flag and waving it proudly. "Hi, Captain," she said, glowing. "You remembered me." Everyone watching fell apart. "You told me I was brave," she said. "But tonight, you were the bravest." The host turned away, whispering into his mic, "My daughter's the same age." Traoré's lips quivered. He placed a hand over his heart. "You give me strength," he whispered. "You are the future I fight for." Then came a moment no one expected. She looked right into the camera and said, "Next time someone tells me to sit down, I'll say, 'Stand up like Captain Traoré.'" And just like that, the feed cut. But no one left. The audience didn't just stand. They rose. Because this wasn't just a broadcast. This was a chapter in something bigger. That night, back in his Washington hotel room, Captain Traoré sat quietly. His phone was vibrating with messages from world leaders, celebrities, even strangers. But it was the envelope slid under his door that made his hands shake. It was from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. The letter read, "Dear Captain Traoré, tonight, you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every soul who was ever told to sit down and stay quiet. We are creating a permanent exhibit. It will be called Dignity Under Fire. We would be honored to feature your words." He set the letter down, whispered to himself, "Not for me, for all of them." Outside, people had gathered, not to protest, but to thank him. A week later, something even more unexpected happened. Karoline Leavitt, the woman who walked off the set, returned. No makeup, no crew, no media. She handed the producer a folded piece of paper, asked him to give it to Traoré. He read it during a press conference. It said, "I said, sit down, boy. And you stood taller than I've ever seen a man stand. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope your people, and my daughter, grow up in a world that learns from your strength, not my ignorance." The room was silent. Traoré looked up from the note and said, "We don't heal through silence. We heal through courage." And today, she showed some. From that day on, even his harshest critics started calling him something new, the man who made America listen. Months passed. Headlines faded. But in that studio, one thing stayed the same, a single empty chair. Center stage. No sign. No explanation. Because it didn't need one. It meant dignity. It meant courage. It meant that one man walked into a storm and walked out a symbol of grace. Later that year, Traoré spoke at the UN. But it wasn't his speech that made waves. It was the moment he pulled out a small, hand-drawn American flag. "This," he said, "was given to me by a child who believed I stood for something good. That means more than any medal." Then he looked into the camera. "America, don't just clap. Change." If this story touched you, if something in it made your heart pause, tell me in the comments what moment hit you the most. And if you believe in dignity, grace, and truth, subscribe. Because here, we tell stories that matter. Stories that make you feel. Thank you for watching. And never sit down when it's time to stand up.